too. It's always good to like support.
Good afternoon, everyone. So lovely to see all your smiling faces. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Jillian Hayes. I am a professor here. I just am only here on Fridays. So if you're not normally here on Fridays, that's why you don't see me that often. It is really my very distinct pleasure to introduce Amy Voida today. We went to dinner last night and Matt brought out a picture from when the two of them first met. Neither of them has aged an ounce. I looked for a picture last night and I couldn't find one that I felt like I was going to bring out in public. Okay. So instead, I will ask this question. How many of you in this room are 27, 28 years oldish or younger? Anyone? Okay. None of you were in school yet when Amy and I first met. So there's your, you can do that math for your fun Friday afternoon. I have had the pleasure of growing up with Amy in this profession is the way I think of it. We met in grad school in Atlanta, and the thing I admire most about Amy is that she is always the person doing this sort of like weird thing no one else is doing. So when every good sensible grad student was hiding out and like doing their research, Amy decided to create a whole new PhD program to the benefit of a whole lot of people who have now gone through the HCC program at Georgia Tech. When the rest of us were like, yeah, we'll work in nonprofits, but we'll be really focused on the healthcare or the education or the whatever the thing was, Amy was like, no, let's think about the nonprofit as the entire thing that we're going to think about, and created a whole new way of thinking about nonprofit work. So it has been my great pleasure to know you for many years and to have my thinking expanded in these ways. So hopefully you all will get to enjoy having your thinking expanded as she talks to us some more about nonprofit data infrastructure and all that good stuff. So over to you.
I don't think I've ever been introduced as weird before. I feel like I'm the most boring person in the whole world, so I'm gonna get that in writing from you after. Oh my goodness. Okay. I have about 45 minutes of content, and then I would love to take questions with the caveat that half of what I'm going to talk about happened before COVID, so I can't guarantee I'll remember any of it. So. All right. Well, as you all know, we live in a culture in which data is ubiquitous, right? We produce it, we consume it largely without thinking about it. But today I'd like to see if we can shake off a little bit of that taken for grantedness and see data really with some fresh eyes by making data strange. And I'm going to do so in the context of nonprofit organizations. Okay, so I'm an associate professor in the Department of Information Science at CU Boulder. I also have this not very enviable title of being founding faculty, which means I went crazy for about 4 years launching a new program. But I conduct empirical and design research largely in partnership with nonprofit organizations, exploring the role of information and communication technologies, and both nurturing, but I hope provoking work for the common good. The problems that are addressed by the nonprofit sector are interdisciplinary ones, and so is my lab and the people with whom I am honored to surround myself. We all come from very different backgrounds. Some of us even have interdisciplinary backgrounds among ourselves, but it gives us an expertise to tackle a broader diversity of research with broader impact. So just a tip of my hat to these folks who've been the driving force behind most of the work I'll be talking about today. All right, as I alluded to in my abstract, I've experimented with a bit of a different genre of talk, maybe affirming what Jillian said to begin with. It's a mix of a research talk about the complexities of information systems in the nonprofit sector, and then something of a love letter to one of my favorite constructs in HCI, defamiliarization. So even if you don't care a whit about nonprofits, although I kind of hope you do, hopefully you'll learn something useful about defamiliarization in the process. All right, so I'm going to start by introducing the construct of defamiliarization, and then I'll make a quick pitch for why study information technology in the nonprofit sector. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of our time today sharing 7 different strategies for defamiliarization using examples of my own research. And then I'll wrap up with a bit of a plug for better foregrounding defamiliarization in our curriculum. Have any of you encountered defamiliarization in classes before? Okay, here we go then. What is defamiliarization? Defamiliarization is a technique of presenting to audiences common things in an unfamiliar or strange way, so they can gain new perspectives and see the world differently. It's a term coined by a Russian literary theorist to help explain the role of art in the world. It helps us shake off the taken for grantedness of things that are familiar, right? We defamiliarize them. In other words, it's about making familiar things seem strange. All right, as a extreme musical theater geek, my absolute favorite example of defamiliarization is the musical Wicked. Anybody see it? Movie? Stage? Stage. Okay. We're all familiar with the story of Dorothy Gale, right? Yes, Dorothy, our favorite Dorothy. Farm girl from Kansas gets swept up by a tornado, transported to the land of Oz. Yes? Yes, the Wicked Witch or the wizard says, you must bring me the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West before I will send you home, right? Okay, super familiar story, but Gregory Maguire's book, Stephen Schwartz's musical, causes us to question everything we not thought we knew about Dorothy Gale, right? Is the Wicked Witch of the West really wicked? Or is she a social activist who'd been framed and scapegoated, right? And is Glinda the Good really good? Or is she just a self-absorbed ladder climber? Okay, making us question things. Another really lovely example of defamiliarization is the clock that sits above the fireplace in Harry Potter's best friend's house, right? We're all familiar with clocks. Everybody familiar with clock? We all know clocks, right? They help us keep track of time. And we know that the things we choose to keep track of are signifiers of what our culture finds important, right? Our culture values time, particularly making good use of it. So we invented technology to keep track of it. But in the Weasley household, clocks don't keep track of time. They keep track of people. Are they at Quidditch practice? Are they at school? Perhaps they're in mortal peril, right? The Weasley clock forces us to shake off our taken for grantedness of clocks, right? To take a fresh look at that technology, what kind of data drives it. It also urges us to stop and question the primacy of time in our society, asking us just perhaps if the people we love might be more important to keep track of than time. Defamiliarization, making the familiar strange. As I mentioned earlier, the term defamiliarization originated in literary theory, helping us differentiate the role of art from the everyday. Art helps us see new meaning. It asks us to see things from a different point of view or question that which we take for granted. Or as Anais Nin puts it much more eloquently than I can, it is the function of art to renew our perception. What we are familiar with, we cease to see. The writer shakes up the familiar scene, and as if by magic, we see a new meaning in it. But the construct of defamiliarization has also been taken up by fields in the social sciences, encouraging us to learn to see the world with fresh eyes, to actively interrogate that which we take for granted. Sociologist Bowman characterizes it this way: in an encounter with the familiar world, sociology acts as a meddlesome and often irritating stranger. It disturbs the comfortingly quiet ways of life by asking questions no one among the locals remembers being asked, let alone answered. Such questions make evident things into puzzles. They defamiliarize the familiar. Suddenly, the daily way of life must come under scrutiny. Both applications of defamiliarization have been taken up in HCI. Much of the qualitative work in our field takes this inquisitive stance towards understanding the role of information technology in a variety of contexts, defamiliarizing them. And many design researchers use their work to turn evident things into puzzles, to create friction, urge us to see new meaning in our experiences. Defamiliarization is this amazing construct whose use transcends subcommunities of art discipline and extends end to end across the pipeline. But despite this really impressive resume, I hardly ever see it taught in our curriculum. So I'd like to organize the bulk of my talk around 7 strategies for defamiliarization, which I'm hoping you'll be able to use in your own research. Okay, but before we dive into those strategies, I need to make a quick pitch for the nonprofit context, a bit of a context where we'll be spending our time. First and foremost, why should computer and information science care about information and technology in the nonprofit work sector? Well, probably most obviously, the broader impact of working with nonprofit organizations is immense. These are the organizations that help us solve society's most pressing problems: mass migration of refugees, discrimination, systematic underdevelopment of affordable housing, and on and on and on. And in the United States, the nonprofit sector ends up filling gaps in services that are underprovided by the government, which, as should be absolutely apparent as we transition into a new administration, is a moving target. The gaps that need to be filled change constantly with policy, and they sometimes change even more abruptly and substantially every 4 years. As their charters change, so do these organizations' information and technology needs. The nonprofit sector requires some of the most fluid and dynamic information infrastructure anywhere. Designing these is a huge challenge. And if that weren't enough, the data that nonprofits collect, the data that stands to help us understand and address these pressing social problems, is highly sensitive and increasingly politicized. When I launched this research agenda 15 years ago, I never imagined I'd be advising students whose organizational partners are operating under the constant threat of litigation. Nevertheless, designing information systems that protect both organizations and their clients without hampering their work, that too is a pretty big information challenge. So all in all, nonprofit organizations are an amazing critical edge case for our field. Between their dynamic data, their politicized data, the fact that they're chronically under-resourced in both technology and technical expertise, if we can solve their information challenges, we've made some pretty amazing inroads for almost all organizations. All right, why is it important then to defamiliarize this work? I'm going to give you a slightly snarky paraphrase from just about every review I received for about the first 5 years that I was doing this work. It is so sweet that you want to help nonprofits, but we've already studied organizations. Over and over and over, I heard this as a brush off, as if to say, no, nothing new here, just move on, right? But the situation was actually this. Our field had studied organizations that had enough money to hire researchers: the Xerox PARCs, the IBMs, the US military, and none of these organizations looked like anything that I was seeing in the field. So in truth, as I launched my research agenda, I wasn't just having to defamiliarize nonprofit information work. I had to defamiliarize organizational information work, asking my colleagues to stop and question what counts as an organization worth studying, and to try to see more of a diversity of organizations with fresh eyes. Okay, so how do we do that? Sociologist Ryan Gunderson has a book entitled Making the Familiar Strange, and in it he presents a topology of 7 strategies that social scientists use to make the familiar strange, or to see our taken for granted reality in a new light. I'm going to introduce each of the 7 and then do my best to provide an example from my own work. Okay, Gunderson's first strategy of defamiliarization is metaphorical. In this strategy, we use language from different domains to create a new frame of reference and direct our attention to new things. Wrong way. Okay, part of what was, and frankly still is, implicit in many of the reviews that I receive is a belief that nonprofit organizations are just lacking, right? If we bestowed enough of our extraordinary technical expertise on these organizations, they would be so much better off. Now, if that doesn't smack of colonialism, or maybe it's easier to hear if I rephrase. If only our great technical empires could just colonize these poor backwards nonprofit organizations, make them more like the great organizations we already know, all would be solved. So with these kinds of stakes, really preventing nonprofits from being colonized, metaphorical defamiliarization could help to reframe the information work of nonprofits, to help legitimize their expertise, really of these sort of nonprofit natives, right? So my research started out to broadly explore information work and to try to find a metaphor that would help us better relate to what was going on. So in one of my earliest studies, which I did here, because I had the most gracious postdoc supervisor who let me wander off and do all sorts of random weird things. Thank you, Judy. I interviewed volunteer administrators from a diversity of classes of organizations. Volunteer administrators work at this key intersection of internal facing organizational systems and external facing systems that they use to interact with their volunteers. So after hearing about these broad-based experiences, my first impression, and probably my second and my third as well, was that their infrastructures were a total mess. And it wasn't just me thinking this, my informant said this as well. She says, this is where we get crazy. This is nuts. We don't have a database of our volunteers. We probably have 7 databases for volunteers. All of them have different information. It took us 3 to 4 months to even figure out who had what databases. Although it might be tempting just to go with the metaphor of a dumpster fire and call it a day, it doesn't really get us anywhere. So instead, I had to dig into the analysis and identified 3 different genres of systems that were strategically selected and actually quite creatively and resourcefully pieced together. So while it may look really ungainly, each of these classes of systems has been appropriated because the benefits outweigh the costs in this context. Everyone uses paper in ways that served as databases. Paper shine-in sheets still reign supreme. And my personal favorite, one volunteer administrator who tracked data about how many volunteers she had every day on her wall calendar. And then at the end of the month, she tallied up her numbers. Paper is unbeatable for collaboration. Everyone can use it. And the tangibility of paper marks it clearly as a master copy, so the data doesn't fall out of sync. Everyone also uses personal information management software as databases. So many spreadsheets, structured data in documents, address books, reappropriated for organizational data collection. PIM software is always accessible, even when an organization can't afford an enterprise database. The number of creative ways that spreadsheets can be customized, oh my God. And enterprise databases have the advantage of being scalable, but we're often really a last resort, as they're the most expensive, but also the most frequently abandoned. So I needed another metaphor, one that foregrounded this immense resourcefulness and creativity of these volunteer administrators piecing together this workable solution. And to me, what I saw looked more like a homebrew setup, all pieced together with all of the positive DIY connotations that come with it. This variety of resources that people have pieced together to satisfy their information needs, they sometimes include actual databases, but more typically consisted of other resources. But nevertheless, the volunteer administrators still refer to these as their databases. So we do the same. Using metaphorical defamiliarization, then we can shift the framing away from dumpster fires, away from giant infrastructural messes, or these so-called poor backwards organizations, and direct our attention instead to the infrastructural creativity and resourcefulness of these volunteer administrators. Metaphor, our first strategy for defamiliarization. All right. If you're interested in more about this work, I've got a 2011 Chi paper written in collaboration with your alumni, Ellie Harmon and Balanai. Okay, second strategy for defamiliarization is comparative historical. So here, scientists make the familiar strange by comparing the familiar here and now with the past. Often, especially in our technical fields, we expect things to be different. So the study that led to the Homebrew Databases study was data collected in 2010. And after so much time now, I wondered what kinds of changes might have occurred. So I headed back out into the field, interviewed a new set of 19 volunteer administrators, again from a diversity of nonprofits, looking for that comparative perspective. And to my surprise, I found that things had not changed. The ecosystem of tools is undergoing a nearly continuous state of turn still. And databases are still fragmented across a proliferation of paper-based tools, spreadsheets, and enterprise databases, even still. Informants are also still reverse engineering this assemblage of systems so that it just satisfies their information needs. Or as this volunteer administrator put it, we kind of jury-rigged it. But in reverse engineering their systems to satisfy their work, informants frequently ended up collecting a degraded quality of data. And this degraded data quality came in 5 different forms. Most commonly, we see out of sync or out of date data, as multiple systems and modalities of systems are used frequently and swapped in and out. We see a lack of data fidelity, what several informants called, I just bulked the data, by which they meant they totaled up the number of hours someone signed in every month and just entered that hourly total on some random day in their database. We see loads of incomplete data, often because volunteer administrators are relying on volunteers to do their data entry, and they don't want to be pushy about data collection and risk losing their volunteers. We see anecdotal, or what some called modest data. Most volunteer administrators report logging their best intuitions about data, or they intentionally underestimated their data, so they didn't come across as being too boastful. And finally, garbage data, a genre very succinctly named by one volunteer administrator who said, we're required in the system to answer yes or no on all of that, or receive constant notification that it's not there. So we just hit yes or NA on everything. I really hope folks nationally are not pulling data because they've got about 3,000 participants with garbage data in there. Each of these genres of degraded data, while completely suitable for local needs, ends up foreclosing many alternate or future uses of those data. So the irony here is that in defamiliarizing nonprofit information work through this comparative historical strategy, we actually find a startling similarity in the state of nonprofit information systems. And what we defamiliarized instead were our expectations about this pace of change. Crucially, then, we defamiliarize familiar phenomenon through comparative historical analysis, whether we find the differences we expect or surprising similarities that defamiliarize our expectations of the phenomenon themselves. All right, this is a work in progress. If you're interested, sometime in the next year, look for a paper with a title that was probably going to look something like that. Or email me. Okay, our third strategy for defamiliarization is scopial. Here we make the familiar strange by zooming in or out to examine a phenomenon at an unconventional level of analysis. Now, there are so many different ways to zoom in or out, but in my line of research, it's been typical to focus on information infrastructure. What are the assemblages? How are they configured? Maybe we zoom in a little bit and ask what classes of systems are used and what are their affordances, or even maybe we zoom in a little bit more and ask what are the characteristics of the data. But for this next study, I zoomed in even more, not just to focus on the schema, how data is organized, but on the primary key that holds it all together. I zoomed way in. So in this research, we conducted 2 case studies of the organizational network of 2 human service organizations, one working in HIV/AIDS services and another working in homelessness services. And we conducted interviews with 43 human service professionals, including with employees that worked at those focal organizations, and then individuals that worked with organizations in their surrounding network. And because the handoff of client data was so prevalent in these collaborative relationships, we heard an enormous amount about client identity and identifiers. Okay, quick note. In the same way that I refer to any technologies that support database practices as databases, regardless of whether they are technically databases or not, we're also bounding this research around all identifiers that support primary key practices, right? Whether or not they are technically primary keys. So for example, a client ID that's used to help sort a spreadsheet, or a name that's written at the top of a referral form that's passed between organizations. We find that different stakeholders use different variants of identifiers and primary keys to support work practice that are far more complex and social than the linking of data tables. Yet we also find that the low-level properties of the primary key, they're bubbling up through the infrastructure and forcing end users to work on the infrastructure's terms. So, for example, the workflow that's imposed by relational databases is that the primary key must be established first, right? Whether it is automatically generated by the system or by a staff member. It's just not possible to commit a row to a relational database without a primary key. They're also typically unchangeable. Once you've got them, you can't change them. And these normative characteristics of relational databases end up shaping data collection practices. But in the human service context, the collection of primary key data before everything else is actually really problematic. Here's one informant who says, there are a number of very personal things that we have to focus on. There's also trust issues because you're asking for like a social security number and all of this other stuff. And we're working with clientele that don't necessarily trust the system or authority figures or people in general. Relational databases also require that primary keys must be unique. Yet the varied needs of all these nonprofit networks create a proliferation in the mapping between individuals and their associated primary keys. Here's an example from the HIV/AIDS Services Organization. We had a client who, and this happens more frequently, they give false names when they go to get tested for HIV. And she had done this intake with a person, the name she'd given for testing was in the false name that he gave. So she had to redo the entire intake process under the correct name because there's no way to go back and edit the previous information. It was null and void because of the fake name. So what we see here are that these low-level technical properties of the primary key are bubbling up through the infrastructure and forcing end users to work on the infrastructure's terms. A class of infrastructure problem that Keith Edwards calls interjected abstractions. So the relational database and its infrastructural abstractions are in some ways becoming the work of human service provision. As one HIV/AIDS provider reflected, well, a lot of my clients are getting to the point now when I'm not even asking them the questions on the form. I say, hey, how's it going? And they're answering everything. So our third strategy for defamiliarization, scopial, zooming in or out to make the familiar strange by taking on a different level of analysis. If you're more interested about this study, I've got a 2019 CSCW paper with Chris Bach and Lane Benjamin that digs in even more. Okay, our fourth strategy for defamiliarization is sympathetic. Viewing a phenomenon from the perspective of somebody with a different social position. Now, our human-centered fields largely grew up with the strategy that we need to approach design from the perspective of the end user. But what if there are multiple end users with very different needs? So for the past 5 years or so, I've been collaborating with a nonprofit microlending organization named Kiva. Kiva partners with community-based organizations in parts of the world where people can't access financial services that they need. So Kiva posts loan opportunities on their website. They invite lenders to loan in $25 increments to help people like Morona. We, myself and a colleague, are helping Kiva design a recommender system to prioritize different lending opportunities. Now, like all organizations, Kiva has many different stakeholders, but I want to focus on two, borrowers and lenders. Morona, for example, is one of Kiva's borrowers. She's an artist in Tajikistan, the poorest country in Central Asia, where more than 2/3 of the population lives below the poverty line. But this loan is not just economically impactful, it is culturally impactful as well. Her work will help ensure that traditional handicrafts are not lost to history. A worthwhile investment, no? Are you awake? I lost you. Okay. Now here's one of the lending teams on Kiva. This is my favorite lending team. Teams are groups with shared affinities, and this team is made up of people who love to fish and are completely transparent about their interest in funding loans for entrepreneurs who make their living fishing. A team with a mission that clearly aligns with their collective identity. Now, the gotcha here is that guys holding fish will never lend to Morona, no matter how compelling her case is. So how is Kiva meant to negotiate their mission to fund worthy entrepreneurs who can't access financial services with their need to attract donors who often have very specific motivations and biases for lending? So here we interviewed 23 Kiva employees from different parts of the organization, some from UX and corporate giving, where employees are predominantly working on meeting the needs of lenders. We also interviewed Kiva employees who work from Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and their job is to advocate for lenders in these regions of the world. Now, these informants expressed a wide range of philosophies for what would constitute fairness in a recommender system and how they enacted fairness in their work. Couple examples. Some informants expressed views of fairness that focused on achieving the best outcome. For example, you'll have to choose one loan that's the most impactful because everybody needs help to some degree. Yeah. Others expressed a more Aristotelian views of fairness that focused on the worthiness of the recipient. For example, there are some lenders who don't like choosing which loans to fund because they don't believe in themselves as an arbiter of who deserves. But there are others who sit very comfortably in this place of evaluating who deserves a loan and who doesn't. Totally different version of fairness. Others focused on enabling equality of opportunity. So for example, it's not just that Kiva has investments, it's that there are investments in that country. So that's where I want to focus. It's all about the gaps. Where are the gaps in funding? Totally different yet again. And finally, some participants expressed a more Kantian focus on rules and responsibilities. So this participant says, our algorithm is determining whether or not people get airtime. We're curating it to a huge extent. The number of people involved, the number of rules, systems, processes involved in getting a loan onto the website is super high. And the algorithm that presents them to lenders we made, so yeah, it's a marketplace and stuff, but we are responsible for proper rulemaking. 4 really different versions of what fairness could mean, each with totally different implications for algorithm design. But in most situations, more than one fairness logic applies. And the trick is figuring out where, when, and to what degree. And then for our goals, using this diversity of sympathetic perspectives to figure out how to weight different factors in the loan recommendation algorithm. So here we not only apply sympathetic defamiliarization to a different social position, we apply sympathetic defamiliarization to contrast and find potential design positions among multiple different social positions. If you're interested in more about this work, we've got a 2023 fact paper that I would point you to, and more coming out. All right, 5th strategy of defamiliarization. Now this stands in really stark contrast to sympathetic defamiliarization. Here we use suspicional defamiliarization to make the familiar strange. Employing the art of mistrust to unmask a phenomenon. For this example, I turn to politics. Now, what most of my research has been with human service organizations, here I set out to be suspicious of the information work of political action committees and other similar types of nonprofits that advocate for special issues. Methodologically, this work is quite a bit different from my others. So shortly after the 2016 election, we wanted to understand how ideologically polarized nonprofits used data in their advocacy work. We identified 5 conservative, 5 liberal organizations, compiled a corpus of 1 month of data of blog posts leading up to election day. It was 2016, people were still blogging back then. We identified over 2,000 instances of quantitative data, which we operationalized as people counting things, right? So we didn't include dates and stuff. Coded the data in MaxQDA based on 3 Aristotelian principles of persuasion. The first of which is ethos. Understanding what is being counted reveals what data are considered charismatic by the organization. We coded both what is being counted. Are they counting money? Are they counting people? Are they counting time? as well as how those counts are being communicated. So are they using a specific number, a calculation, some vague narrative description? Second is pathos, which asks, what are the rhetorical work of data? Are data being used to make an issue or identity more positive, more negative? And what is the object that's being credited or discredited? Are they discrediting an individual? Are they crediting an organization? And then finally, logos. What logics underlie the use of data? Are the data empirical or not? By assessing this relationship between the instance of quantitative data and the surrounding text, we can better understand the rhetorical maneuvers that are taken by organizations to sway their audiences. Some examples will hopefully help here. All right, so we've got a blog quote from the DNC on your left, the RNC on your right. In the yellow, we have ethos, right? The quantitative data of the DNC, they're counting money, the economy. They present those data in the form of a calculation. The RNC, which is on your right, on the other hand, they count people, low-income children. And they present very vague data, millions. For pathos, the DNC is using data to credit a group, their democratic leadership, while the RNC is using data to discredit the same group of democratic leadership. And finally, logos. The RNC's use of data is empirical, logically connecting politicians to the policies they support. The DNC, on the other hand, is using unempirical logic, causally oversimplifying factors that contribute to the economy. Quick breeze through. We find that liberals and conservatives count different things. What data are charismatic are different. While liberal organizations predominantly count people, conservative organizations predominantly count money. For pathos, we see very different patterns of crediting and discrediting. Liberal organizations are predominantly crediting, that's in green, with an increase in crediting as the election approaches. Conservative organizations, on the other hand, are predominantly using data to discredit, that's in red. But they do so less and less as the election approaches, switching in the last week or so to more crediting uses of data. Go figure. Okay, so for logos, 15% of data for both liberals and conservatives were unempirical. But there are distinctions in what kind of unempirical data these organizations used. There are also a range of kinds of unempirical data, some that we typically find more acceptable than others. So for example, projections are unempirical data, but they're based on empirical data. And those liberal organizations use more frequently than conservative organizations. But blatant rhetorical fabrication, on the other hand, they were used with similar frequencies by both liberal and conservative organizations. But despite the suspicional motivations of this research, the vast majority of data are actually empirical. Much online persuasion occurs by using true information and reasonable opinion. So while so much research at the moment is focused on identifying and fixing misinformation, we really should also be focusing on analyzing how data is being cooked rhetorically beyond assessing its degree of truthfulness. Suspicional defamiliarization, unmasking a phenomenon that isn't quite what it seems. If you're interested in this work, I'd love for you to take a look at our 2023 CSCW paper. Sixth strategy of defamiliarization is critical defamiliarization, in which we contrast what society claims to value with what it really is. Our research method for enacting critical defamiliarization is rooted in an understanding that stories about computing matter just as much as technological artifacts in shaping our experiences of technology. So here we explore the logics and promises of a set of 5 philanthropic tools by examining key texts about those systems, and then using a range of analytic strategies to surface the normative claims about philanthropic organizations and philanthropy that are embedded in these technology stories. Some examples of what our cases included: Blackbot, whose text portrays social change as happening through the nonprofit organization. So the key role for technology as they see it is an improving operation of that organization. Charity Navigator envisions a future in which increased technical transparency and accountability, operationalized rather unproblematically in a 5-star rating system, will facilitate better outcomes. Volunteer Match has a technology story that brings together the central promise of the internet. It's going to connect people with an identification of what they see as the most critical problem facing nonprofits: not enough volunteers. So Volunteer Match positions itself as a technological fix for volunteer recruitment. Attentively promises to help organizations tap into real-time passion, something that happens in the moment on social media, to be leveraged by organizations, but only if they are paying attention to the conversations that are happening. The implication is that without them, organizations risk operating in the past, stuck on the wrong side of a sweeping socio-technical transformation. Together, these tools envision futures that are characterized by very familiar tropes about computing. A future in which automation and efficiency free up time, where technical innovation implies social innovation, technology facilitates continuous growth in bigger and better and stronger communities, and in which increased transparency, accountability, and measurement tools lead to bigger and better impacts. They envision a future in which technology suddenly helps philanthropy achieve social impact that has eluded it up till now. They characterize a present that is imperfect and in need of improvement. Yet these stories cultivate unrealistic expectations and imperatives for the nonprofit sector. What we see here are design stories that are really design fictions, but potentially harmful rather than progressively speculative. If we as a community want to be user advocates, we have to find new ways of intervening in the crafting of potentially harmful technology stories and in the overpromising of technical innovations. Critical defamiliarization, contrasting what society claims to value with what really is. All right, if you're interested in more on this, there's a 2017 Chi paper written by my amazing colleague and your alum, Ellie Harmon and Britt Bob. All right, the last of Ryan Gunderson's 7 strategies is non-human, decentering humans and technology and centering other animals and the biophysical. This is the one defamiliarization strategy I have never used. But it's always good to have something to aspire to. But so I don't leave you empty-handed here. There's a phenomenal and phenomenally depressing example of this strategy in anthropologist Stephen Gonzalez Montserrat's study of the environmental impacts of data storage. It's called The Cloud is Material. So I'll leave you with that. And that brings this part to a close. 7 strategies of defamiliarization, different ways to see a phenomenon in a new light. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm surprised that defamiliarization isn't taught more in our field. So I got off my soapbox a few years ago and I co-designed a course focused around defamiliarization. My husband, Steve, and I launched this course last summer in London. Here we explore the human-centered design process through the lens of defamiliarization, training students in both ethnographic and design strategy, and of seeing and depicting data in new or strange ways. Now here's the fun part. To scaffold the development of these skills, we relocate students to a new cultural context where the use of data and technology ceases to be quite so familiar. And along the way, we're able to visit sites that allow us to more deeply engage with different defamiliarization strategies. We visit Bletchley Park, where crossword puzzle mavens and chess wizards worked alongside some guy named Alan Turing to break the German Enigma code during World War II. Here we use a historical strategy for defamiliarizing organizational information work, but we also lean very deeply into a sympathetic strategy for understanding the diversity of individuals, especially the women who were central to this effort, instead of focusing on Alan Turing and further perpetuating that myth of the lone male genius, right? We also explore defamiliarization strategies through design. So we go on a trip to Warner Brothers Studios, and we explore how magic is an often used metaphor for our technological futures, and how science fiction and fantasy can offer critical defamiliarization of the world we live in now. Now, there's more information about this course on my website, in case you're interested in learning more, or maybe even in coming along with us. We've cross-listed the course with as a graduate class, and I don't know, CU's at a broad office admits non-CU students, so just saying. Maybe. All right. Defamiliarizing data in nonprofit organizations has helped me to see a really different organizational context for information systems. One in which data are politicized and precarious. One in which we can be startled that the pace of technical change may just be slower than we thought. One in which accommodating multiple stakeholders brings into question what it means to build values into technology. One in which taken for granted norms of infrastructure stand at odds with basic people skills and trust building between nonprofits and their clients. One in which the way that data is used doesn't just depend on the functioning and mission of the organization, but its ideology as well. And one that finds itself subject to technology stories of impossible futures. Defamiliarizing data in nonprofit organizations has helped me to see organizational information systems in a new light. And I hope you find one of these strategies helpful in your own work as well. Go for
Hi,
it.
I'm Toby, and thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it and found it super interesting. And I was curious about, so with my stuff, I'm looking at online communities that are like grassroots and organic, where people are in leadership that didn't mean to be.
Yeah.
And I guess like from this perspective, I guess like with nonprofits, it's more like people are intending their governance structure. So I guess I know that there's the meta governance program that's been looking at like different tools on how to form like their governance and organizational structures. And I guess with the organizational structure, how do you find that ability and the relationships with people who are hired and on payroll versus people who are like volunteers but really active, and how that frames the data usage?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it really varies from organization to organization. So I've worked with some organizations that are entirely volunteer, right? They file their tax paperwork. They've got their organization on the books, but it's not enough for any of them to make money. So their executive director has a full-time job somewhere else, and everybody's volunteers, right? But there is structure around it, and that's, I think, part of what makes it a little bit different from what you're looking at. But there's others that are sort of behemoth nonprofits, right? And almost everybody is a full-time paid employee, not paid nearly enough, but they're still full-time paid employees, right? And I think there's a really interesting literature you might find about alternative organizing. It comes mostly out of the communication literature, but it looks at some of the gray area between, I don't want to say between social movements and organizations, but kind of across that range of grassroots and stuff. So if you're looking for some language to think about what you're seeing that may not be quite so organizational, you might check that out and see if that's helpful.
Yeah, I guess I was curious on just how they end up organizing the data that they're collecting from their clientele and the differences between the folk who have funding that's like consistent and the folk who are just volunteers, but there is not anyone who's like judging the volunteers because it's just only volunteers.
Yeah, that's pretty highly variable too. There are some organizations where there's a national organization in New York or in Washington, and they impose technology on the sort of local organizations. The local organizations also invent their own technology that sort of, again, satisfies their information needs. They have to work around the national stuff. Everybody in their job seems to create their own working solutions too. There's very rarely a playbook in nonprofits. So people they're creative and they're resourceful, and they make use of whatever is good and they ignore what they don't like. But I think, you know, what comes from employees versus volunteers is, there's a sort of veil there where it's like, you know, some volunteers are doing the work of a executive director, and some employees are really at the front line. So, yeah, I don't think that's really a very helpful answer, but that's what I've seen. So,
I'm curious. It's
Yeah,
so much more.
yeah.
Yes, Mimi.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I have a lot of thoughts just from my own experience in nonprofits, but I do have a question that's a little bit more sort of conceptual and methodological. So as a cultural anthropologist, I love the focus on defamiliarization because we also have a methodological toolkit that I think derives from a lot of similar impulses. We, you know, use words like denaturalization or, you know, critical cultural analysis, but there's a lot of, you know, strategically kind of similar moves, I feel like. But I'm curious, like in terms of the relationship between the mode of defamiliarization and your topic of nonprofits, do you feel like there's something uniquely compatible about those two modes? Like, are there things within nonprofits that, like, is it as a sector, as you were kind of alluding to in your preamble, uniquely misunderstood or people have a lot of assumptions about, or is it, do you see defamiliarization as a method or approach that really just can apply to anything equally? Or is there something about the match between your method and topic? I'd love to hear more about that.
sure if there's, I don't know whether it's the, if there is a match, I'm not sure whether it's the topic or whether it's the field's relationship to the topic that I've been trying to navigate over time. But I should clarify that I didn't go into my research trying to make sure I was using one of each of these strategies, right? When I went to design the curriculum for this new class, I found Ryan Gunderson's book, and he had done a content analysis of a ton of sociological studies, and he created, like, inductively generated this list of 7 strategies. And then the more I looked at them, I thought, hey, I've done that. And I did that too. And then, you know, I kept going. I'm like, oh man, you know, so I should do a talk on that because I've done more than them, you know, and then the sort of higher level reflection of like, actually, you know, am I defamiliarizing, like when I was naming this talk, I'm like, am I defamiliarizing nonprofits? Am I defamiliarizing organizations? And then realizing like that in retrospect, you know, my relationship with the field as I've been kind of pushing this line of research has really influenced how I've had to shape things and think about them. So this is all, you know, revisionist history in the framing. Right? So, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I get a lot of reviews where a reviewer too says, Amy Voida has already done this research. Work with community organizers, so they don't work in organizations that are hostile to the nonprofit sector,
yeah.
but I think from the perspective of reviewer too, anyone who doesn't work at a company is in the not-for-profit sector or something. I don't know.
That's weird.
But
Yeah,
that was
I'm
the part-
sorry.
No, it was very, I enjoyed that part. You're talking, became fixated, and it was difficult for me to like rejoin for the rest. And then I had a question for a long time that Mimi actually helped me come to. Are you also defamiliarizing data? Because I saw before that you were defamiliarizing the database and you had defined that broadly as practices or could include things written on paper. But I feel a little bit haunted throughout this that the presumption that data is a kind of thing that stands in mimetic relationship to something else in the world has not been defamiliarized. Like, for example, when data does the stuff that you observed, it's degraded data.
Yeah.
So like according to what idea of data has the data been degraded? Right? Because
Right.
wouldn't defamiliarization be like, it's not degraded anything, it's
Yes.
just the thing it is.
Yeah, and that's, you know, I probably didn't make that point particularly well, but it's perfectly useful in their context, right? And if anything, I wouldn't want them to do more at all. They're already doing too much. They're already collecting too much data, right? So part of what I see here is a tendency for us as a field to again, denigrate what's going on. And I think, Matt, you had a lovely paper about sort of databases forever ago that was, we really need to legitimize things that are imperfect and cobbled together, and understand that these kinds of things are actually moving work forward and that it's legitimate. The whole second half of the paper flips the argument, so you only got a taste of it, but I definitely see how that comes across here.
But thanks again.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'm sorry. Send them to me, I'll set them straight. What else? There's like 3 minutes on that clock on the wall.
We can also go outside and then we can talk like formally. Maybe people who are too shy to ask a question will go outside. Can we do that?
Should we drinks?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
so much.